When single mother Elena Vasquez offered a broken-down stranger a glass of water and a place to rest at her crumbling inherited desert ranch in Nevada, she had no idea that the grateful drifter was carrying the authentic treasure map drawn by Butch Cassidy himself, a map leading to the legendary Wild Bunch's final $25 million railroad heist fortune buried somewhere on her 8,000-acre property, transforming her from a struggling waitress facing eviction into the guardian of the most valuable lost treasure in American frontier history. Before we dive deeper into Elena's incredible discovery, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories like this inspire you, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more shocking about a small-town librarian who uncovered documents that could rewrite American Civil War history. At 29 years old, Elena Vasquez was staring at the third consecutive month of overdue bills scattered across the rickety kitchen table of the most godforsaken piece of land she'd ever seen, wondering how inheriting her great-uncle Miguel's desert ranch had somehow made her life infinitely worse than it had been when she was sleeping on her sister's couch with her 7-year-old daughter Sophia. The inheritance that she'd initially thought might be the answer to her prayers had instead become a financial nightmare that threatened to consume what little stability she'd managed to build as a single mother working double shifts at Danny's Diner in Reno. The ranch itself was a monument to decades of neglect and the kind of harsh desert conditions that had broken stronger people than Elena. Located 47 miles southeast of Reno in the Carson Valley, the 8,000-acre property consisted primarily of sagebrush, rattlesnakes, and dirt so hard it seemed like concrete, punctuated by occasional Joshua trees that looked like they were perpetually reaching toward heaven in desperation. The main ranch house, built sometime in the 1940s, was a single-story adobe structure with a red tile roof that leaked in at least 12 places, walls that had been painted white sometime during the Reagan administration, and windows that were so warped they couldn't close properly, allowing the desert wind to fill every room with a fine coating of dust that Elena swept up daily but never seemed to eliminate. The property included a barn that was more holes than walls, a chicken coop that hadn't housed chickens since the Clinton administration, and a well that produced water so brackish it was barely suitable for washing dishes, let alone drinking. Elena had been forced to drive to town twice a week to fill 5-gallon jugs with potable water, an expense that was straining her already impossible budget and adding 94 miles of driving to her weekly routine. Uncle Miguel had died intestate, at the age of 78, leaving behind nothing but debts, unpaid property taxes, and a piece of land that 3 different real estate agents had described as unmarketable due to its remote location, lack of infrastructure, and soil conditions that made any kind of agricultural development economically unfeasible. The property taxes alone were $3,200 annually, an amount that represented nearly 2 months of Elena's take-home pay from the diner, where she earned $11.50 an hour plus tips that averaged about $60 per day when she was lucky enough to work the breakfast and lunch shifts. Elena's financial situation was a carefully balanced disaster that could collapse at any moment. Her monthly income from the diner averaged $2,100 when she could get full-time hours, but restaurant work was unpredictable, and slower months often left her short of the money needed to cover basic expenses. Her monthly rent for the tiny 2-bedroom apartment she'd shared with Sophia in Reno had been $100 to $350, leaving approximately $750 to cover groceries, gasoline, car insurance, health insurance premiums, utilities, and every other expense that came with raising a child alone in Nevada. The inheritance had forced Elena into an impossible choice. She couldn't afford to keep paying rent in Reno, while also covering the property taxes and maintenance costs for the ranch. But she also couldn't afford to simply abandon the property, because Nevada law made her responsible for the accumulated debts and tax obligations that came with the inheritance. Moving to the ranch had seemed like the only option that might allow her to survive financially, even though it meant Sophia would have to change schools. Elena would have to drive 94 miles round-trip to work every day, and they'd be living in a house that was barely habitable. The daily commute from the ranch to Danny's diner was slowly destroying Elena's 2009 Honda Civic, a car that already had 187,000 miles on it and was showing signs of transmission problems that Elena couldn't afford to repair. The round-trip drive consumed approximately $18 worth of gasoline every day, and the wear and tear on the vehicle was accelerating maintenance issues that were becoming increasingly expensive to address. Elena had calculated that the car probably wouldn't survive another 6 months of daily highway driving, but replacing it was financially impossible given her current circumstances. Sophia had adapted to their new living situation with the resilience that children often display in difficult circumstances, but Elena could see the stress and isolation affecting her daughter's behavior and academic performance. The nearest school was 23 miles away in Minden, Nevada, requiring Elena to drive 46 miles every morning and afternoon for drop-off and pick-up, adding another hour and a half to her daily routine and approximately $12 in gasoline costs. Sophia had been forced to leave behind friends, teachers, and extracurricular activities that had been important parts of her social and educational development. The ranch house itself presented daily challenges that Elena was learning to navigate through necessity rather than expertise. The electrical system was ancient and unreliable, frequently causing power outages that left them without refrigeration, lighting, or the ability to operate the small window air conditioning unit that provided the only relief from summer temperatures that regularly exceeded 110 degrees. The plumbing was similarly problematic, with water pressure so low that it took 20 minutes to fill a bathtub, and pipes that made alarming groaning sounds whenever Elena attempted to use more than one fixture at a time. The heating system consisted of a propane furnace that consumed fuel at an alarming rate and frequently failed to maintain comfortable temperatures during the winter months when desert temperatures could drop below freezing. Elena had learned to supplement the furnace with space heaters, but running multiple electric heaters resulted in power bills that often exceeded $200 per month, money that she desperately needed for other expenses. The isolation of the ranch was perhaps the most challenging aspect of their new living situation. The nearest neighbor was 4.7 miles away, and cell phone service was sporadic at best, making it difficult for Elena to stay in contact with potential employers, maintain social connections, or ensure that she could be reached in case of emergencies involving Sophia's school or health. The ranch's landline telephone had been disconnected for non-payment before Uncle Miguel's death, and reconnecting service required deposits and installation fees that Elena couldn't afford. Shopping for groceries, household supplies, and other necessities required a 47-mile drive to Reno, where prices were generally higher than what Elena had been accustomed to paying when she lived in town and could comparison shop at multiple stores. The distance made it impractical to take advantage of sales or special offers that required multiple trips, forcing Elena to purchase larger quantities of non-perishable items that strained her weekly budget, while also requiring her to plan meals and household management with military precision to avoid running out of essential supplies. Elena's work schedule at Danny's diner had become increasingly complicated by her living situation. The restaurant's busiest shifts were breakfast and lunch, which generated the best tips, but required Elena to be at work by 6 a.m., meaning she had to leave the ranch at 4:30 a.m. to account for the drive time and Sophia's school drop-off schedule. The early morning routine meant that Elena was often getting only 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, a schedule that was affecting her health, her job performance, and her ability to provide adequate attention to Sophia's needs. The restaurant's owner, Danny Kowalski, had been understanding about Elena's transportation challenges, but restaurant work was inherently unpredictable, and Elena's inability to work evening shifts or stay late for special events was limiting her earning potential and making her a less valuable employee than servers who lived closer to the restaurant and had more flexible schedules. Elena had attempted to supplement her diner income by exploring work-from-home opportunities, but the ranch's unreliable internet connection and frequent power outages made it nearly impossible to maintain the consistent online presence required for remote customer service or data entry positions. The few freelance writing and transcription jobs she'd attempted had been frustrated by technical difficulties that resulted in missed deadlines and unsatisfactory performance ratings. The psychological toll of the financial stress was compounded by Elena's growing sense of isolation and her worry about the impact their living situation was having on Sophia's development and future opportunities. Elena had grown up in a stable middle-class family where financial security was taken for granted, and her current circumstances felt like a failure of everything she'd been taught about hard work, education, and personal responsibility. Sophia's father, Marcus, had been absent from their lives since Sophia was 2 years old, providing no financial support and maintaining no contact with his daughter, despite court orders that required child support payments of $340 per month. Elena had long since given up trying to collect the money through legal channels, understanding that the cost of enforcement often exceeded the amount collected and that Marcus had demonstrated a consistent ability to avoid financial responsibility. Through job changes and interstate moves, Elena's family relationships had been strained by her financial difficulties and her decision to accept the ranch inheritance, despite everyone's advice to simply walk away from the property and its associated debts. Her sister Carmen, who had provided housing for Elena and Sophia during their most desperate period, had been supportive, but was also dealing with her own family's financial pressures and couldn't continue providing assistance indefinitely. Elena's parents, who lived on fixed retirement incomes in Arizona, had offered emotional support but lacked the financial resources to provide meaningful assistance with Elena's mounting expenses. Their occasional care packages of groceries and children's clothing were deeply appreciated, but couldn't address the fundamental structural problems that were making Elena's situation increasingly unsustainable. The local community around the ranch was sparse and consisted primarily of other struggling property owners who were dealing with similar challenges related to the harsh desert environment and the economic realities of trying to maintain rural properties without adequate income. Sources: Elena had met a few neighbors during her first months at the ranch, but geographic distance and everyone's individual survival challenges had prevented the development of the kind of community support networks that might have provided practical assistance or social connection. Elena's attempts to sell the ranch had been unsuccessful due to the property's numerous problems and the limited market for remote desert acreage. The real estate agents she'd consulted had explained that the property would need significant improvements to attract serious buyers. Improvements that would cost far more than Elena could afford and more than the property would be worth even after the improvements were completed. The possibility of subdividing the land for development had been explored, but ruled out due to zoning restrictions, the lack of adequate water and electrical infrastructure, and the prohibitive cost of conducting the environmental studies and obtaining the permits required for residential or commercial development in the area. Elena had researched various government assistance programs for rural property owners and single mothers, but most required documentation, income verification, and application processes that were difficult to complete given her work schedule and the ranch's communication limitations. The few programs for which she qualified provided minimal assistance that barely covered a fraction of her monthly expenses, while requiring ongoing paperwork and compliance requirements that added additional stress to her already overwhelming daily routine. As Elena sat at her kitchen table on this particular August evening, surrounded by unpaid bills and trying to calculate whether she had enough money to buy both groceries and gasoline for the next week, she had no idea that her life was about to change in ways that would transform her from a struggling single mother into the subject of international media attention and the center of the most significant archaeological discovery in Nevada history. The treasure map that would soon change everything was at that moment in the possession of a weather-beaten drifter named Thomas Hartwell, who was walking across Elena's property in the fading desert light. He carrying secrets that would unlock wealth beyond Elena's wildest dreams and reveal that her worthless inheritance was actually sitting on top of the most valuable lost treasure in the American West. Elena had spent countless sleepless nights over the past 4 months researching every possible solution to her financial crisis, exploring options that ranged from practical to desperate as she tried to find a way to keep herself and Sophia from sliding deeper into poverty. The kitchen table that served as her makeshift office was permanently covered with printouts from government assistance websites, applications for second jobs that she couldn't realistically manage given her commute, and loan applications that had been rejected due to her lack of credit history and collateral. The ranch's isolation meant that Elena had to drive to the Minden Public Library twice a week to access reliable internet service for her research, a 46-mile round trip that consumed both time and gasoline she couldn't afford, but was necessary for exploring potential income sources and assistance programs. During these library sessions, Elena had discovered that Nevada offered several rural development grants and agricultural assistance programs, but most required property improvements or business plans that involved initial investments far beyond her current financial capacity. Elena had investigated the possibility of leasing portions of the ranch to hunters, recreational vehicle enthusiasts, or film companies seeking desert locations, but the property's remote location and lack of basic amenities made it unsuitable for most commercial activities. The hunting lease option was particularly disappointing because several neighbors had suggested it as a potential income source, But Elena learned that successful hunting operations required significant upfront investments in facilities, insurance, and marketing that she simply couldn't afford. The solar energy option had seemed promising initially, given Nevada's abundant sunshine and state incentives for renewable energy development, but Elena discovered that solar installations required substantial initial capital, long-term land commitments, and technical expertise that made the option impractical for a single mother with no business experience and no access to investment capital. The solar companies she contacted were interested in much larger properties with better road access and existing electrical infrastructure. Elena's attempts to generate income from the property itself had been uniformly unsuccessful. The soil was too poor and the climate too harsh for any kind of agricultural production without massive investments in irrigation, soil improvement, and climate control systems. The few hardy desert plants that grew naturally on the property had no commercial value, and attempts to harvest them for sale to landscaping companies proved economically unfeasible due to transportation costs and market demands for much larger quantities than Elena could realistically produce. The livestock option had been briefly considered and quickly abandoned when Elena learned about the costs associated with fencing, water systems, feed, veterinary care, and the licensing requirements for commercial livestock operations. Even goats, which were supposed to be hardy and low maintenance, required initial investments and ongoing expenses that exceeded Elena's available resources, while offering no guarantee of profitability in the limited regional market. Elena's work situation at Danny's diner was becoming increasingly precarious, as her exhaustion from the daily commute and stress from her living situation began affecting her job performance and relationships with customers. Restaurant work required energy, enthusiasm, and the ability to maintain a positive attitude even during difficult shifts, qualities that were becoming harder for Elena to sustain as her financial situation deteriorated and her sleep schedule became more irregular. Danny Kowalski had been patient with Elena's occasional tardiness and her inability to work evening shifts, but he had also made it clear that the restaurant's business needs had to take priority over individual employees' personal circumstances. Elena understood that her position was vulnerable and that losing her job would make her situation completely unsustainable, but she also recognized that her current schedule was slowly destroying her health and her relationship with Sophia. Chuck, drive to and from work each day, had become a dangerous routine that Elena navigated through a combination of caffeine, determination, and prayer. The desert highways were notorious for accidents involving drivers who fell asleep at the wheel, and Elena found herself fighting fatigue during the evening drive home, particularly after double shifts that left her physically and emotionally exhausted. The Honda Civic's air conditioning had failed 3 weeks earlier, making the summer drives almost unbearable and adding another repair expense to Elena's growing list of financial obligations. Sophia's adjustment to their new living situation had been more difficult than Elena had initially realized. The 7-year-old had been forced to leave behind friends, teachers, and familiar routines when they moved to the ranch, and the isolation of their new home meant that Sophia had limited opportunities for social interaction with children her own age. The nearest neighbor children lived over 6 miles away, making casual playdates impossible without extensive planning and transportation arrangements. The school situation presented daily challenges that went beyond the simple logistics of transportation. Sophia's new school in Minden was larger and more impersonal than her previous school in Reno, and she was struggling to make friends and adapt to different teaching styles and academic expectations. Elena had received several calls from teachers, expressing concern about Sophia's withdrawn behavior and declining performance in subjects where she had previously excelled. The after-school care situation was particularly problematic because Elena's work schedule often required her to be at the diner until late afternoon, but the school's aftercare program ended at 6 p.m., creating a gap between when Sophia needed to be picked up and when Elena could leave work. Elena had arranged for Sophia to stay with a neighbor family in Minden 3 days a week, but this arrangement required payment of $75 per week and still didn't solve the problem of transportation from the neighbor's house to the ranch each evening. Elena's relationship with her daughter was suffering under the stress of their circumstances. The long commutes meant that Elena and Sophia spent hours each day in the car together, but these drives were often characterized by fatigue and stress rather than quality time for conversation and connection. Elena found herself snapping at Sophia over minor issues and then feeling guilty about her impatience, creating a cycle of tension that was affecting both their emotional well-being. The ranch house's condition continued to deteriorate as Elena struggled to keep up with basic maintenance while managing her work schedule and Sophia's needs. A leak in the bathroom ceiling had created water damage that was beginning to affect the structural integrity of the roof. But getting repair estimates required taking time off work that Elena couldn't afford and spending money on contractors. That was beyond her current budget. The electrical problems had worsened over the summer months, with power outages becoming more frequent and lasting longer each time they occurred. Elena had learned to keep flashlights, candles, and battery-powered devices readily available, but the unpredictable power supply made it difficult to maintain food storage, complete homework assignments, or maintain any kind of normal evening routine with Sophia. The water situation was becoming increasingly problematic as the well's output decreased during the hottest months of summer. Elena had been told by a neighbor that desert wells often experience seasonal variations, but the current flow rate was barely adequate for basic household needs, and the water quality was so poor that Elena had to continue making expensive trips to town for drinking water. Elena's social isolation was becoming as significant a problem as her financial difficulties. The demands of her work schedule and the distance from town made it nearly impossible to maintain friendships or romantic relationships, leaving her without the emotional support that might have helped her cope with the stress of her circumstances. The few friends she'd maintained from her previous life in Reno found it difficult to visit the ranch due to the distance and the property's inhospitable conditions. The lack of reliable internet and cell phone service at the ranch meant that Elena was often cut off from communication with the outside world for hours at a time, creating anxiety about emergencies involving Sophia's school or healthcare needs. Elena had purchased a satellite internet connection, but the service was expensive, slow, and frequently interrupted by weather conditions, making it unsuitable for most practical applications. Elena's health was beginning to suffer from the stress and irregular schedule that her circumstances required. She had lost weight due to irregular eating patterns and the physical demands of her work, and she was experiencing frequent headaches and difficulty sleeping that were affecting her ability to function effectively during her long workdays. The lack of adequate health insurance meant that Elena was avoiding medical care except for absolute emergencies, a decision that was increasingly risky given her declining physical condition. The financial calculations that Elena performed each night revealed the mathematical impossibility of her situation. Even if she worked every available shift at the diner and eliminated every possible expense, her income would never be sufficient to cover the ranch's carrying costs, while also providing adequate living conditions for herself and Sophia. The property taxes alone represented an insurmountable obstacle, and the accumulating utility debts and maintenance requirements were creating additional financial pressures that were growing larger each month. Elena had consulted with a bankruptcy attorney about the possibility of walking away from the ranch and its associated debts, but Nevada's inheritance laws made her personally responsible for the property's obligations, and bankruptcy would affect her credit rating and employment opportunities for years to come. The attorney had explained that bankruptcy might eliminate some debts, but wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of Elena's inadequate income and lack of marketable skills. The few job opportunities that might have provided better income required relocating to urban areas where housing costs would consume any additional earnings, or they required educational credentials and training that Elena couldn't afford to pursue while supporting Sophia and managing their current living situation. Elena had investigated online education programs, but the ranch's internet limitations and her work schedule made it impractical to pursue formal coursework that might lead to better employment opportunities. Elena's attempts to supplement her income through part-time work or freelance activities had been frustrated by the logistical challenges of her location and schedule. The few work-from-home opportunities that didn't require reliable internet or specific equipment were either scams or provided such minimal compensation that they weren't worth the time investment required to complete them successfully. The seasonal nature of restaurant work meant that Elena's income would likely decrease during the winter months when tourism and business travel declined in the Reno area. Danny's diner typically reduced staff hours during slower periods, and Elena's relative, newcomer status and transportation limitations made her vulnerable to hour reductions that could make her situation even more precarious. Elena had explored the possibility of renting out portions of the ranch house to generate additional income, but the property's condition and location made it unsuitable for most potential tenants, and the legal requirements for rental properties included safety and habitability standards that the current house couldn't meet without significant investments in repairs and improvements. The emotional toll of watching Sophia adapt to their declining circumstances was perhaps the most difficult aspect of Elena's situation. The 7-year-old had stopped asking for things she wanted and had begun showing signs of premature maturity and responsibility that worried Elena about the long-term effects of their current stress on her daughter's development and future relationships. As Elena prepared for another night of restless sleep, interrupted by worry about bills, work performance, and Sophia's well-being, she had no way of knowing that salvation was walking across her property in the form of a mysterious stranger carrying secrets that would transform their lives and reveal that her worthless inheritance was actually the key to the greatest treasure discovery in Nevada history. The scorching afternoon heat of August 23rd had reached 112 degrees by 2:15 p.m., When Elena first spotted the figure stumbling across the eastern boundary of her property, moving with the unsteady gait of someone who had been walking in the desert sun far longer than was safe for human survival. She was sitting on the ranch house's front porch, seeking whatever shade the deteriorating overhang could provide while attempting to repair a tear in one of Sophia's school uniforms using a sewing kit she'd purchased at the dollar store in Minden. Tatus, stranger appeared to be an elderly man, probably in his 70s, wearing clothes that suggested he'd been traveling rough for an extended period. His faded denim jacket was covered with dust and showed signs of recent tears. His boots were worn down to almost nothing, and he was carrying what appeared to be an ancient leather satchel that he clutched protectively against his chest as he made his way slowly toward the ranch house. Elena's first instinct was caution, given the isolation of her property and the fact that she was alone with Sophia, who was inside the house working on homework at the kitchen table. But as the stranger got closer, Elena could see that he was clearly in distress, stumbling every few steps and showing obvious signs of heat exhaustion that made him more of a person in need of help than a potential threat to her family's safety. "Sir, are you okay?" Elena called out as she stood up from her porch chair, still maintaining a safe distance but concerned about the man's condition. The desert heat could be lethal to people who weren't prepared for it, and this stranger looked like he'd been walking for hours without adequate water or protection from the sun. The man looked up at Elena with eyes that were bloodshot and unfocused, clearly suffering from dehydration and heat exposure. When he tried to speak, only a hoarse croak came out, and Elena realized that he was probably in more serious trouble than she'd initially thought. Despite her natural wariness about strangers, Elena's instincts as a mother and her basic human compassion overcame her caution. "Come up here into the shade," Elena instructed, gesturing toward the porch. "You need to get out of this heat right now, and I'll get you some water." She called toward the house, "Sophia, stay inside and keep working on your homework. I'm helping. Someone who's sick from the heat." As the stranger made his way slowly up the 3 steps to the porch, Elena could see that he was in worse condition than she'd realized. His face was flushed red with heat, his breathing was shallow and rapid, and his hands were shaking slightly as he collapsed gratefully into the aluminum lawn chair that Elena positioned for him in the shadiest part of the porch. "My name's Elena Vasquez," she said as she hurried into the house to get water. "This is my ranch, and you're going to be fine once we get you cooled down and hydrated." Elena filled the largest glass she could find with the coldest water from her refrigerator, added some ice cubes, and grabbed a wet dishcloth to help cool the stranger down. When she returned to the porch, the man was sitting with his head in. His hands, the leather satchel still clutched tightly in his lap. Elena noticed that despite his obvious distress, he seemed to be guarding the satchel as if it contained something extremely valuable or important. "Here, drink this slowly," Elena instructed as she handed him the glass of water. "I know you're probably thirsty enough to drink a gallon, but if you drink too much too fast when you're this dehydrated, it can make you sick. Small sips and I'll keep refilling it as much as you need." The stranger took the glass with hands that were still trembling slightly and took a careful sip of the water. The expression that crossed his face was one of profound relief and gratitude, as if he hadn't expected to find help in this remote desert location. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, his voice still weak but stronger than it had been when Elena first approached him. "I've been walking since dawn and I got turned around. Thought I was going to die out there in that heat." Elena applied the Wet cloth to the back of his neck and forehead. Basic first aid for heat exhaustion that she'd learned during a safety training session at the diner. "What's your name? And what are you doing walking around out here in the middle of nowhere? This isn't exactly a place people just pass through." The man took another sip of water and seemed to be gathering his strength before responding. "Name's Thomas Hartwell," he said, his voice becoming clearer as the water and shade began to help his condition. "I've been looking for this property specifically. Been searching for it for more years than I care to count." Elena refilled his water glass and studied Thomas Hartwell more carefully. Now that he was out of immediate danger from heat exhaustion, she could see that, despite his weathered appearance and rough traveling clothes, there was something about his manner and speech that suggested education and intelligence. His eyes, while still showing the effects of heat and exhaustion, had a sharp quality that indicated mental alertness. "Looking for my property?" Elena asked, puzzled by his statement. "Why would anyone be looking for this place? It's the middle of nowhere, and there's nothing here but sagebrush and bad soil. Are you some kind of real estate developer or something?" Thomas shook his head and took another drink of water before responding. "Not a developer, ma'am. I'm what you might call a researcher. I study historical sites and old stories, trying to separate fact from fiction in some of the legends that have grown up around this part of Nevada." He paused to drink more water, and Elena noticed that he was still keeping a protective grip on the leather satchel. "Your property has a history that goes back to the early 1900s, and I believe it might be connected to some events that took place during the heyday of the Wild Bunch gang." Elena had heard of Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch from movies and television shows, but she'd never connected them to Nevada or to her specific area. "You mean like Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid? I thought they operated up in Wyoming and Utah, not down here in Nevada." Thomas smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "On Elena's porch. That's what most people think. And that's exactly why this area has been overlooked by treasure hunters and historians for so many decades. But the Wild Bunch had operations and hideouts throughout the entire western region, including several locations right here in central Nevada." Elena was becoming more intrigued by Thomas's story, but she was also maintaining a healthy skepticism about claims involving historical treasures and legendary outlaws. "Even if that's true, what does it have to do with my property? This ranch has been in my family for decades, and nobody ever mentioned anything about outlaws or historical significance." Thomas set down his water glass and looked directly at Elena with an expression that combined excitement and nervousness. "Ma'am, I think your property might be the location of the Wild Bunch's final and largest robbery, a Union Pacific Railroad heist that took place in 1901 and netted the gang over $25 million in today's money. Money that was never recovered and never spent because the gang was forced to split up immediately after the robbery." Elena stared at Thomas, not sure whether he was telling her something incredible or whether the heat exhaustion had affected his mental state. "You're talking about buried treasure? Like actual buried treasure worth millions of dollars? Here, on my property?" Thomas nodded and carefully opened the leather satchel that he'd been guarding so protectively. "I'm talking about more than just stories and legends, ma'am. I'm talking about documentation that proves what happened and where. The money was hidden." From the satchel, Thomas withdrew what appeared to be several very old documents wrapped in oiled cloth. The papers looked genuinely antique, with yellowed edges and fading ink that suggested they were indeed from the early 1900s rather than modern reproductions. These documents came into my possession through a series of circumstances that took me 15 years to piece together, Thomas explained as he carefully unwrapped the papers. They include correspondence between Wild Bunch members, maps of their hideout locations, and most importantly, a detailed map drawn by Butch Cassidy himself, showing exactly where the railroad money was buried. Elena leaned forward to examine the documents more closely, trying to determine whether they looked authentic or like clever forgeries. The paper and ink certainly appeared to be genuinely old, and the handwriting had the characteristics of early 20th century penmanship rather than modern script. "How do you know these are real?" Elena asked. "And even if they are real, how do you know the treasure is still there after more than a century? Wouldn't someone have found it by now?" Thomas smiled and pointed to one of the maps, which showed geographical features that Elena recognized as corresponding to landmarks on her property. The beauty of Cassidy's hiding place was that it was so remote and so well concealed that even people who lived in the area wouldn't stumble across it accidentally. And the gang was forced to split up so quickly after the robbery that only Cassidy knew the exact location. He showed Elena several other documents that appeared to be letters and notes between gang members, written in different handwriting styles, but all referring to the same robbery and the same hiding place. Cassidy was captured and imprisoned before he could return for the money, and by the time he was released, the area had changed enough that he couldn't relocate the exact spot. He spent years trying to find it again, but never succeeded. Elena studied the map more carefully and began to recognize specific features that corresponded to landmarks on her property. A distinctive rock formation that she passed every day during her drives to town was clearly marked on the map, as was the dry creek bed that ran along the property's northern boundary. According to these documents, Thomas continued, the treasure was buried in a location that's marked by 3 specific geological features that form a triangle: a red rock outcropping, a natural spring, and a grove of Joshua trees that were already mature when the gang used this area as a hideout. Elena felt her heart rate increase as she realized that she knew exactly where Thomas was describing. The red rock formation was clearly visible from her kitchen window. The natural spring was the source of the brackish water that fed her well, and the Joshua tree grove was located about half a mile from her house in a depression that she'd always thought was just a natural low spot in the terrain. "If this is real," Elena said slowly, "and if the treasure is actually still buried where this map indicates, what would that mean? Who would own it? And how would anyone go about recovering it legally?" Thomas rewrapped the documents carefully and returned them to his satchel. Under Nevada law, treasure found on private property belongs to the property owner, provided that proper procedures are followed for excavation and documentation. But recovering something like this would require archaeological expertise, legal documentation, and coordination with state and federal authorities. Elena was beginning to understand that even if Thomas's story was true, accessing any buried treasure would involve complications and expenses that might be beyond her current capabilities. How much would it cost to properly excavate and document something like this? And how long would the process take? Thomas finished his second glass of water and appeared to be recovering from his heat exhaustion. The excavation itself might cost $50,000 to $100,000 if it's done properly with archaeological supervision and legal documentation. But, Mom, if these documents are accurate and the treasure is where Cassidy's map indicates, we're talking about finding $25 million worth of gold and currency that's been appreciating in value for over a century. Elena tried to process the mathematical implications of what Thomas was telling her. Even if the excavation costs were substantial, a $25 million treasure would solve every financial problem she'd ever imagined and provide security for Sophia's future that would transform their entire lives. But Elena was also aware that treasure hunting stories were notoriously unreliable, and that people had spent fortunes searching for buried treasure that turned out to be nothing more than folklore and wishful thinking. How certain are you that these documents are authentic and that the treasure actually exists? Thomas stood up from his chair, steadier now that he'd recovered from the heat exhaustion. I've spent 15 years researching Wild Bunch history and tracking down every piece of documentation I could find. I've had these papers examined by handwriting experts and historical document specialists. Everything checks out as authentic. He looked out across Elena's property toward the geological features marked on Cassidy's map. But the only way to know for certain whether the treasure is still there is to follow the map and see what we find. That's why I've been looking for this property, and why I was willing to walk across the desert to get here. Elena realized that Thomas Hartwell's arrival on her property might represent either the solution to all her problems or the beginning of complications she wasn't prepared to handle. But she also understood that her current circumstances were unsustainable, and that she needed to at least explore possibilities that might offer hope for a better future for herself and Sophia. Elena spent the rest of that afternoon and most of the evening listening to Thomas Hartwell tell the most extraordinary story she'd ever heard, a tale that began with his own family history and wound through 15 years of detective work that had led him across the American West in search of documentation that most historians considered nothing more than folklore and legend. As the sun set over the Nevada desert and Sophia finished her homework inside the house, Thomas laid out a narrative that was so detailed and compelling that Elena found herself believing, despite every rational instinct that told her to remain skeptical. Thomas's interest in Wild Bunch history had begun with his grandfather, William Hartwell, who had worked as a telegraph operator for the Union Pacific Railroad during the early 1900s and had been on duty during several of the train robberies that had made Butch Cassidy and his gang infamous throughout the Western Territories. William Hartwell had kept detailed records of the robberies, including information that had never been released to the public because railroad companies preferred to minimize publicity about their security vulnerabilities. My grandfather documented everything, Thomas explained, as he showed Eleanor a worn leather journal filled with handwritten notes and sketches. He recorded not just the official reports that went to law enforcement, but also the rumors, the speculation, and the unofficial information that circulated among railroad employees who had insider knowledge about the gang's methods and possible hideout locations. The journal contained entries that described the Wild Bunch's final Union Pacific robbery in unprecedented detail, including information about the specific train car that had been targeted, the exact amount of money stolen, and the direction the gang had traveled after the heist. William Hartwell had noted that unlike previous robberies, where the gang had scattered immediately, this final robbery had involved the entire group traveling together toward a predetermined hiding place, where they planned to wait until law enforcement attention died down. The railroad had put together a task force of Pinkerton detectives and federal marshals specifically to track down the Wild Bunch, Thomas continued, showing Elena telegrams and official correspondence that his grandfather had copied and preserved. The gang knew that this robbery would bring unprecedented law enforcement pressure, so they had planned an elaborate hiding strategy that involved burying the money in a location so remote that they could return for it years later when it was safe. According to William Hartwell's documentation, the gang had chosen central Nevada for their hiding place specifically because it was sparsely populated, geographically isolated, and outside the immediate search radius that law enforcement agencies were focusing on in Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado, where the Wild Bunch had operated most frequently. The Nevada location was intended to be so unexpected that investigators would never think to look there. Thomas had spent his adult life following up on his grandfather's research, tracking down other railroad employees' families, searching historical archives, and gradually assembling pieces of evidence that supported the story of the Nevada treasure cache. His investigation had led him to county courthouses, historical societies, and private collections throughout the western states, where he had discovered additional documentation that corroborated his grandfather's records. I found correspondence between gang members that had been preserved in family collections for over a century, Thomas explained, showing Elena photocopies of letters that discussed the robbery and its aftermath. Most of these families had no idea what they were preserving, but the letters contained specific references to geographical landmarks and hiding places that allowed me to narrow down the search area. The breakthrough in Thomas's research had come 3 years earlier when he discovered the estate sale of a family in Utah whose ancestor had been a Wild Bunch associate who had escaped capture after the final robbery. Among the items being sold were personal papers that included what appeared to be Butch Cassidy's original hand-drawn map showing the location where the railroad money had been buried. The family selling the estate had no idea what they had, Thomas said, as he carefully removed the map from his satchel. They were selling everything for whatever they could get, and I was able to purchase the entire collection of papers for $500. It wasn't until I got home and started examining everything carefully that I realized what I'd found. The map itself was drawn on heavy paper that showed signs of age and wear, consistent with early 1900s materials. The ink had faded to brown, and the paper had the yellowed, brittle characteristics of genuine antique documents. Most importantly, the geographical features depicted on the map corresponded precisely to landmarks that Thomas had identified through his years of research. Elena studied the map carefully, trying to match the drawn features with the landscape she knew from living on the property for 4 months. The correspondence was remarkably accurate, with the red rock formation, the natural spring, and the Joshua tree grove positioned exactly as they appeared in reality. Even more convincing were smaller details on the map that matched features Elena had observed during her daily walks around the property. According to the map, Thomas explained, pointing to markings that indicated distance and direction, the treasure is buried at the center of a triangle formed by these 3 major landmarks at a depth of approximately 12 feet. Cassidy's notes indicate that the location was marked with a ring of stones that would be visible to someone who knew what to look for. Thomas had brought additional equipment in his traveling pack, including a metal detector and ground-penetrating radar device that he'd purchased specifically for this search. The technology would allow them to identify buried metal objects without extensive excavation, providing a way to verify whether the treasure existed before committing to the expense and complexity of a full archaeological recovery. I've been carrying this equipment for 2 years, visiting potential sites throughout Nevada and Utah, Thomas said. Your property is the 15th location I've investigated, but it's the first one where the geographical features match Cassidy's map with complete accuracy. Elena was impressed by the thoroughness of Thomas's research and the apparent authenticity of his documentation. But she was also aware that treasure hunting was notorious for raising hopes that were ultimately disappointed. Even if the map is real, and even if Cassidy really did bury money here, how do we know it's still there? Couldn't someone else have found it during the past century? Thomas had considered this possibility extensively during his research and had developed compelling arguments for why the treasure would likely remain undisturbed. The location was chosen specifically for its remoteness and the difficulty of accessing it without specific knowledge of the landmarks. Even if someone had stumbled across the general area, they would need to know exactly what to look for and where to dig. He explained that Cassidy's hiding method had involved more than simply burying money in the ground. According to the documentation, the gang had constructed an elaborate underground chamber using materials they had brought with them, specifically for this purpose. The chamber was designed to protect the money from moisture and deterioration, while also making it difficult to detect using casual exploration. The construction technique they used is described in detail in Cassidy's notes, Thomas said, showing Elena sketches that accompanied the map. They dug a shaft 12 feet deep, lined it with wooden planks and waterproof materials, and then sealed it with a stone cap that would be invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. The hiding place had been camouflaged so effectively that even people living in the area wouldn't notice it unless they were specifically searching for it. Cassidy's notes indicated that the gang had spent several days preparing the site, moving natural materials around to make the location blend seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. Elena was beginning to understand that if Thomas's story was accurate, the treasure recovery would involve significant technical challenges beyond simply digging in the right location. What kind of equipment and expertise would we need to properly excavate something like this? And what are the legal requirements for treasure hunting on private property in Nevada? Thomas had researched the legal aspects of treasure recovery as thoroughly as he had investigated the historical documentation. Under Nevada law, treasure found on private property belonged to the property owner, but the excavation process had to comply with state archaeological regulations and environmental protection requirements that could be complex and expensive to navigate properly. The good news is that since this is private property and the treasure would be historical rather than archaeological in the technical sense, the regulatory requirements are manageable, Thomas explained. We would need to file proper documentation with the state, hire certified archaeological supervision for the excavation, and follow specific procedures for documenting and preserving any historical artifacts we might find. The estimated cost for a professional excavation, including archaeological supervision, proper documentation, and legal compliance, would be approximately $75,000 to $100,000. While this was a substantial amount of money, it represented a small fraction of the treasure's potential value, and would ensure that the recovery process was conducted legally and professionally. Thomas had already identified the specific contractors and professionals who would be needed for the excavation, including an archaeological consulting firm in Las Vegas that specialized in historical site excavation, and a legal team that had experience with treasure recovery cases in Nevada. The preliminary work of verifying the treasure's existence using metal detection and ground-penetrating radar could be completed for less than $5,000. The metal detection survey would tell us definitively whether there are significant metal objects buried in the location indicated by Cassidy's map, Thomas explained. If we find evidence of buried metal consistent with the treasure description, then we would know it's worth proceeding with the full excavation. If we don't find anything, then we've only invested a small amount of money in exploring the possibility. Elena was intrigued by the prospect of conducting a preliminary survey that could provide definitive answers about the treasure's existence without requiring a major financial commitment. The $5,000 cost for metal detection and radar survey was still far beyond her current financial capacity, but it was an amount that might be manageable if she could find a way to finance it through loans or partnerships. What would you want in return for sharing this information and helping with the treasure recovery? Elena asked. You've spent 15 years researching this, and you found the documentation that makes it possible. You must want some kind of compensation for your work. Thomas had anticipated this question and had developed a proposal that he believed would be fair to both parties, while also ensuring that the treasure recovery process was handled professionally and legally. I'm proposing a partnership where we split the treasure recovery costs and the eventual proceeds equally. I would contribute my research, documentation, and expertise, plus half of the excavation costs. You would provide access to the property and the other half of the excavation costs. Under Thomas's proposed partnership agreement, both parties would share equally in any treasure that was recovered, but they would also share equally in the costs and risks associated with the excavation process. If no treasure was found, both would lose their investment. But if the treasure was recovered as indicated by the historical documentation, both would receive substantial compensation for their contributions to the project. Elena realized that Thomas's proposal offered her the possibility of accessing an extraordinary opportunity without bearing the full financial risk of the treasure recovery process. Even if she had to borrow or find investors to finance her share of the excavation costs, the potential returns were so substantial that the financial risk seemed manageable compared to the potential benefits. I need time to think about this and to discuss it with my daughter, Elena said. This is the kind of decision that would affect both our lives permanently, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications before I commit to anything. Thomas understood Elena's need for careful consideration and offered to remain in the area for several days while she made her decision. I've been searching for this treasure for 15 years, so I'm certainly willing to wait a few more days for you to make an informed choice about whether you want to pursue this opportunity. As the evening grew late and Thomas prepared to set up his camping equipment in Elena's barn, she found herself facing the most important decision of her life. The treasure story seemed almost too extraordinary to believe, but the documentation appeared authentic, and Thomas's research was impressively thorough and detailed. Elena was also aware that her current circumstances were unsustainable, and that she desperately needed some kind of opportunity that could transform her family's financial situation. The treasure recovery project represented enormous potential benefits, but it also involved risks and complications that she would need to evaluate carefully before making her final decision. Elena spent the night lying awake in her bed, staring At the cracked ceiling of her bedroom, while her mind raced between the impossibility of Thomas Hartwell's treasure story and the equally impossible mathematics of her current financial situation. Every rational part of her brain insisted that buried treasure worth $25 million was the stuff of fantasy novels and Hollywood movies, not the solution to real problems faced by struggling single mothers in the Nevada desert. But the documentation Thomas had shown her appeared genuinely authentic, and his 15 years of meticulous research suggested a level of serious scholarship that was difficult to dismiss as mere wishful thinking. The leather satchel containing Cassidy's map and the supporting documents sat on Elena's kitchen table like a loaded weapon, something that could either save her life or destroy everything she had left to lose. She had examined the papers again after Thomas had settled into the barn for the night, studying the handwriting, the paper quality, and the geographical details with the skeptical eye of someone who couldn't afford to be fooled by elaborate hoaxes or well-intentioned delusions. The map itself was remarkably detailed and accurate in its depiction of landmarks that Elena recognized from her daily life on the ranch. The red rock formation was positioned exactly as it appeared from her kitchen window. The natural spring was located precisely where her well drew its brackish water, and the Joshua Tree Grove was marked in the exact depression where Elena had walked Sophia on weekends when they explored the property together. Even smaller features like dry creek beds and distinctive boulder formations were depicted with an accuracy that would have been difficult to fake without extensive first-hand knowledge of the terrain. Elena had also spent considerable time examining the supporting documents that Thomas claimed were correspondence between Wild Bunch members. The handwriting styles varied between different letters, suggesting multiple authors rather than a single person creating forgeries. The paper and ink showed consistent signs of age and wear that appeared genuine to Elena's untrained eye, though she acknowledged that she lacked the expertise to detect sophisticated forgeries that might fool casual examination. The historical details mentioned in the letters corresponded to information that Elena had been able to verify through internet research during her late-night investigation. The dates, locations, and references to specific railroad operations matched documented Wild Bunch activities that were recorded in historical sources available through online archives and digital library collections. Most compelling was the internal consistency of the story that emerged from the various documents. The correspondence painted a coherent picture of a gang that knew they were facing increased law enforcement pressure and had planned their final robbery as a way to secure enough money to disappear permanently. The decision to hide the money in Nevada, rather than spending it immediately, made sense as a strategy for avoiding capture, and the remote location described in Cassidy's map was exactly the kind of place that desperate outlaws might choose for. A long-term hiding place. Elena had also researched Thomas Hartwell himself, using the limited internet resources available through her satellite connection. She found references to his work as a historical researcher and amateur archaeologist, including articles he had written for regional history magazines and presentations he had given at historical society meetings throughout the western states. His background appeared legitimate and consistent with his claims about spending 15 years researching Wild Bunch history. The financial implications of the treasure discovery, if authentic, were almost impossible for Elena to comprehend in practical terms. $25 million represented more money than she could imagine spending in multiple lifetimes, an amount that would solve not only her immediate foreclosure crisis, but every financial concern she could conceive of for herself and Sophia. Even after paying excavation costs, taxes, and Thomas's 50% share, Elena would receive wealth that would transform her from a struggling waitress into one of the most financially secure individuals in Nevada. But Elena was also acutely aware of the risks associated with pursuing the treasure recovery project. The excavation costs alone would require her to invest money she didn't have in a venture that might yield nothing more than expensive holes in the ground. Even if Thomas agreed to advance her share of the costs, she would be entering into a business partnership with someone she had met less than 24 hours earlier, trusting him with decisions that could affect her family's future permanently. The legal complexities of treasure recovery also concerned Elena, who had no experience with archaeological regulations, partnership agreements, or the tax implications of discovering valuable historical artifacts. Thomas claimed that the legal requirements were manageable, but Elena understood that her lack of knowledge made her vulnerable to mistakes that could result in legal problems or financial losses that would worsen her already precarious situation. Elena was also worried about the impact that treasure hunting activities might have on her relationship with Sophia and their daily routine. The excavation process would likely attract attention from neighbors, media, and curious observers who would disrupt the privacy and security that Elena valued about their remote location. Even if the treasure recovery was successful, the publicity and sudden wealth would create challenges and pressures that Elena felt unprepared to handle as a single mother. The possibility of failure weighed heavily on Elena's decision-making process. If Thomas's research was wrong, if the documents were forgeries, or if the treasure had been removed by someone else during the past century, Elena would be left with significant debts and no improvement in her circumstances. The failure of a treasure hunting venture might also damage her credibility and reputation in ways that could affect her employment opportunities and her ability to provide stable housing for Sophia. Elena had also considered the psychological impact of pursuing such an extraordinary opportunity. The stress and excitement of treasure hunting might provide temporary relief from her current problems, but if the venture failed, the disappointment and financial consequences could be emotionally devastating for both Elena and Sophia. The little girl had already experienced significant instability and stress due to their living circumstances, and Elena was reluctant to expose her to additional uncertainty unless she was confident that the potential benefits justified the risks. Chaku. Practical logistics of managing a treasure recovery project while maintaining her work schedule at Danny's Diner presented additional challenges that Elena wasn't sure she could handle effectively. The excavation process would require Elena's presence and attention during business hours when she needed to be earning income from her restaurant job. Taking time off work for treasure hunting would reduce her already inadequate income while increasing her expenses for excavation costs. Elena had attempted to calculate various scenarios for financing her share of the treasure recovery costs, but her lack of credit history and collateral made traditional bank loans impossible to obtain. Thomas had suggested that Elena might be able to find private investors willing to finance treasure hunting ventures in exchange for a percentage of any discoveries, but Elena was skeptical about entering into financial arrangements with strangers who might have questionable motives or unrealistic expectations. The morning brought no clarity to Elena's decision-making process. only the familiar routine of preparing Sophia for school and herself for another long day of commuting to and from the diner. As she packed Sophia's lunch and gathered the materials needed for the drive to Minden, Elena found herself wondering whether she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life by either pursuing or rejecting the most extraordinary opportunity she was ever likely to encounter. Sophia had noticed Thomas's presence on the property and had asked questions about why a stranger was camping in their barn. But Elena had explained only that Thomas was a researcher who was studying the history of their area. The 7-year-old had accepted this explanation without suspicion, but Elena knew that she would eventually need to provide more detailed information about the treasure hunting project if she decided to proceed with Thomas's proposal. During the drive to Sophia's school, Elena found herself pointing out landmarks that corresponded to features depicted on Cassidy's map, seeing familiar geographical formations with new eyes as she considered their potential significance in Wild Bunch. History. The red rock formation that she passed every day suddenly seemed more prominent and distinctive, the kind of landmark that outlaws might choose as a navigation reference for finding buried treasure. The workday at Danny's diner passed in a blur of routine tasks and customer service that felt surreal against the backdrop of Elena's internal debate about treasure hunting and life-changing decisions. Her co-workers and customers had no idea that she was contemplating an opportunity that could transform her from their struggling colleague into a millionaire. And Elena found the contrast between her external routine and internal turmoil almost overwhelming. During her break periods, Elena continued her research into treasure hunting, archaeological regulations, and partnership law using the diner's internet connection. The information she found confirmed much of what Thomas had told her about legal requirements and excavation procedures. But it also revealed additional complexities and potential costs that hadn't been fully discussed during their initial conversation. Elena learned that successful treasure recovery projects often required environmental impact assessments, historical preservation consultations, and insurance coverage that could add substantial costs to the excavation process. Even if the treasure was found and recovered successfully, the process of authenticating historical artifacts and determining their legal ownership could involve additional expenses and delays that might postpone Elena's access to any financial benefits. The tax implications of treasure discovery were particularly complex, with federal and state agencies requiring detailed documentation and immediate payment of taxes on the fair market value of any recovered artifacts. Elena realized that even a successful treasure recovery might result in substantial tax obligations that would need to be paid before she could access the full benefit of her discovery. Elena also researched the track record of other treasure hunting ventures in Nevada and surrounding states, finding a mixture of success stories and cautionary tales that highlighted both the potential rewards and risks associated with treasure recovery projects. Some individuals had indeed discovered valuable historical artifacts that had provided substantial financial returns, but others had invested life savings in excavation projects that yielded nothing more than expensive disappointment. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication when Elena received a phone call from her landlord's attorney informing her that the ranch's property taxes were further behind than she had realized and that the county was preparing to initiate foreclosure, proceedings that could result in the loss of the property within 60 days. The news added urgency to Elena's decision about the treasure hunting project, as she realized that waiting too long to pursue the opportunity might result in losing access to the property entirely. Elena returned home that evening to find Thomas conducting preliminary metal detection surveys in the area indicated by Cassidy's map, using equipment that beeped and chirped as he moved it systematically across the desert terrain. The sight of actual treasure hunting equipment being used on her property made the entire venture feel more real and immediate than it had during the previous night's theoretical discussions. "I've found several anomalies that are consistent with buried metal objects," Thomas reported as Elena approached his work area. "The signals are strong and located exactly where Cassidy's map indicates the treasure should be buried. We're definitely dealing with something significant down there." Elena felt her heart rate increase as she realized that Thomas's preliminary survey was providing evidence that supported his treasure theory. The metal detection results didn't prove that buried treasure existed, but they did indicate that something metallic was buried in the location described by the historical documentation. "What do the signals tell you about the size and depth of whatever's buried there?" Elena asked, trying to understand the technical implications of Thomas's findings. Thomas showed Elena the metal detector's display screen, which indicated strong signals at a depth consistent with Cassidy's map, and covering an area large enough to contain the substantial quantity of money described in the Wild Bunch documentation. The readings suggest multiple metal objects buried at approximately 12 feet depth, arranged in a pattern that's consistent with containers or strong boxes rather than random debris or natural deposits. Elena realized that Thomas's preliminary survey had moved their discussion from theoretical possibility to practical reality. The evidence suggested that something significant was indeed buried on her property in the exact location indicated by Cassidy's map, transforming the treasure recovery project from speculation into a legitimate archaeological investigation with substantial potential for success. The moment had arrived for Elena to make a decision that would determine not only her family's financial future but also their entire approach to life, risk, and opportunity. The choice between accepting guaranteed continued struggle and risking everything on an extraordinary possibility had become a choice between two specific courses of action, each with clear implications for Elena and Sophia's immediate and long-term circumstances. Elena made her decision during the 47-minute drive back to the ranch that evening, a journey that had become so routine over the past 4 months that she usually completed it on autopilot while worrying about bills, work, schedules, and Sophia's needs. But tonight, with Thomas's metal detection results confirming that something substantial was buried exactly where Butch Cassidy's map indicated treasure should be located, Elena found herself calculating risks and opportunities with a clarity that surprised her with its decisiveness. The mathematics of her situation were brutally simple and left no room for romantic notions about playing it safe or waiting for better opportunities that might never come. Elena's current trajectory led inevitably to foreclosure, bankruptcy, and the destruction of any stability she had managed to create for Sophia during their 4 months at the ranch. The county's accelerated foreclosure timeline meant that she had perhaps 60 days before losing the property entirely, making any delay in pursuing the treasure recovery financially catastrophic regardless of whether Thomas's theory proved correct. But the decision Elena reached during that evening drive involved more than simple mathematical calculations about financial necessity. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, Elena felt like she was being offered an opportunity to take control of her circumstances rather than simply reacting to forces beyond her influence. The treasure hunting project represented a chance to bet on herself and her judgment rather than accepting the slow defeat that had characterized her adult life since Sophia's father had abandoned them. Elena arrived home to find Thomas organizing his equipment and preparing detailed maps of the areas where his metal detection survey had identified promising signals. The professional thoroughness of his approach and the obvious care he was taking with documentation reinforced Elena's growing confidence that he was a legitimate researcher rather than someone trying to take advantage of her desperate circumstances. "I've made my decision," Elena announced, as she joined Thomas at the kitchen table where he was sketching precise measurements and signal locations. "I want to proceed with the treasure recovery project, but I need to understand exactly what we're committing to and how we're going to handle the financial and legal aspects of the partnership." Thomas looked up from his maps with an expression that combined relief and excitement, clearly pleased that Elena was willing to pursue the project, but also aware that her agreement represented the beginning of a complex process rather than the conclusion of their negotiations. "I'm delighted that you're willing to move forward, but you're absolutely right that we need to establish clear agreements about how this partnership will work and what each of us is responsible for." Elena had spent considerable time during her commute thinking about the specific terms and conditions that would need to be addressed in any partnership agreement with Thomas. Her lack of experience with business contracts and archaeological projects made her vulnerable to accepting arrangements that might favor Thomas's interests over her own. But she was also aware that her financial desperation might lead her to agree to terms that weren't truly equitable. "First, I need to understand exactly how much money we're talking about for the full excavation process," Elena said, pulling out a notebook where she had written questions and concerns that had occurred to her during her research and consideration of the project. "You mentioned $75,000 to $100,000, but I need to see detailed estimates for each component of the work." Thomas had prepared comprehensive cost estimates for every aspect of the treasure recovery process, including archaeological supervision, excavation equipment, legal documentation, environmental assessments, and insurance coverage required for conducting major excavation work on private property. The detailed breakdown revealed that professional treasure recovery was significantly more expensive and complex than Elena had initially realized. The archaeological supervision alone would cost approximately $35,000 for a project of the scope they were contemplating, with fees covering not only the actual excavation work, but also preliminary site assessment, documentation of findings, and preparation of reports required by state regulatory agencies. The archaeological consultant would also be responsible for ensuring that the excavation process complied with Nevada's cultural resource protection laws and federal requirements for handling potentially significant historical artifacts. Heavy equipment rental for the excavation would cost approximately $25,000, including specialized machinery for precision digging, soil removal, and site restoration after the treasure recovery was completed. The equipment costs also included transportation charges for moving machinery to the remote ranch location and operational expenses for fuel and maintenance during the excavation period. Legal documentation and regulatory compliance would require approximately $15,000 for preparing partnership agreements, filing required notices with state agencies, obtaining necessary permits, and handling tax documentation for any treasure that was discovered. The legal costs also included contingency planning for potential complications, such as disputes over artifact ownership or challenges to the excavation permits. Environmental assessment and site restoration costs were estimated at approximately $10,000, covering studies required to ensure that the excavation process wouldn't damage sensitive desert ecosystems, and expenses for returning the site to its original condition after the treasure recovery was completed. Nevada's environmental protection regulations required detailed planning for any major ground disturbance activities, particularly in desert areas that might contain protected plant or animal species. Insurance coverage for the excavation project would cost approximately $8,000 for policies covering liability, equipment damage, and potential legal challenges that might arise during the treasure recovery process. The insurance was necessary not only for protecting Elena's property, but also for ensuring that the archaeological consultants and equipment operators could work on the site without exposing themselves to excessive financial risks. Elena was surprised by the complexity and expense of professional treasure recovery, but she was also impressed by Thomas's thoroughness in researching every aspect of the process. The detailed cost estimates suggested that he had approached the project with serious planning and realistic expectations rather than romantic notions about easy money from buried treasure. The total estimated cost is $93,000. Thomas concluded, showing Elena spreadsheets that broke down expenses by category and timeline. Under our 50-50 partnership agreement, your share would be $46,500, payable according to a schedule that matches the excavation timeline. Elena stared at the financial figures, trying to comprehend how she might access nearly $50,000 when her current checking account balance was approximately $237. Even if Thomas was willing to advance her share of the costs, Elena would be entering into debt obligations that represented more than 2 years of her current annual income. "I don't have access to that kind of money through conventional loans," Elena said honestly. "My credit history and income level make me ineligible for traditional financing, and I don't have collateral or co-signers who could help me qualify for business loans." Thomas had anticipated Elena's financing challenges and had researched alternative funding sources that might be available for treasure recovery projects. His investigation had revealed that specialized investment groups and individual investors sometimes provided funding for archaeological ventures in exchange for percentage shares of any discoveries. There are several private investment firms that specialize in funding treasure hunting and archaeological excavation projects, Thomas explained, showing Elena contact information for companies that had financed similar ventures in Nevada and surrounding states. These investors typically provide full funding for excavation costs in exchange for 20 to 30% of any treasure that's recovered. The private financing option would allow Elena to proceed with the treasure recovery without requiring upfront capital, but it would also reduce her share of any eventual discovery by the percentage required to compensate the investors. Elena calculated that even after paying investor fees, excavation costs, and Thomas's partnership share, she would still receive millions of dollars if the Butch Cassidy treasure was recovered successfully. Elena was also intrigued by Thomas's suggestion that they might be able to secure financing from investors who specialized in historical research and archaeological discovery. These funding sources were reportedly less concerned with immediate financial returns than with the historical significance and publicity value of major archaeological discoveries. Some investors are motivated as much by the opportunity to participate in historically significant discoveries as they are by financial returns, Thomas explained. A successful recovery of the Wild Bunch's final robbery proceeds would be international news and would provide investors with publicity and recognition that they value beyond pure monetary compensation. Elena realized that the treasure recovery project might appeal to investors who were seeking opportunities to associate themselves with significant historical discoveries rather than purely commercial ventures. The story of finding Butch Cassidy's lost treasure would generate media attention and historical recognition that could be valuable to investors who were interested in building reputations as supporters of archaeological research and historical preservation. Thomas had already contacted several potential investors and had received preliminary expressions of interest from 2 investment groups that specialized in funding archaeological projects. Both groups had requested detailed information about the historical documentation, site assessment results, and planned excavation procedures before making formal funding commitments. The Nevada Archaeological Investment Group has expressed strong interest in funding the entire project in exchange for a 25% share of any recovered treasure, Thomas reported. They specialize in historically significant excavations and have a track record of successful treasure recovery projects throughout the western states. The second potential funding source was a private collector named Harrison Webb, who had made a fortune in technology investments and had developed an interest in Wild Bunch history as a personal hobby. Webb had reportedly spent substantial amounts of his own money funding historical research projects and was particularly interested in discoveries that might shed new light on the activities of famous outlaws. Webb has indicated that he would be willing to fund the entire excavation in exchange for 20% of any recovered treasure plus first rights to purchase any historically significant artifacts that aren't legally required to be donated to museums, Thomas explained. His terms are more favorable than the investment group, and his personal interest in Wild Bunch history makes him a potentially valuable partner for handling media attention and historical documentation. Elena was encouraged by the apparent availability of funding sources that would allow her to proceed with the treasure recovery without requiring personal financial resources that she didn't possess. The investor partnerships would reduce her eventual share of any discovered treasure, but they would also eliminate the financial risks that had been her primary concern about pursuing Thomas's proposal. The legal structure of investor partnerships also appealed to Elena because it would provide professional oversight and accountability for the excavation process. Experienced investors would presumably ensure that the treasure recovery was conducted according to proper archaeological and legal standards, reducing the likelihood of mistakes or regulatory problems that could jeopardize the project's success. Thomas had prepared draft partnership agreements that outlined the specific responsibilities and compensation arrangements for all parties involved in the treasure recovery project. Elena would provide access to the property and receive 40% of any recovered treasure after investor fees and excavation costs were deducted. Thomas would contribute his research, historical documentation, and project management expertise in exchange for 40% of the net recovery. The remaining 20% would compensate the investors who provided funding for the excavation costs. The partnership agreements also included provisions for handling various contingencies, such as the discovery of artifacts with uncertain ownership, regulatory challenges that might delay or complicate the excavation, and media attention that might affect the project's timeline or security. Elena was impressed by the thoroughness of Thomas's legal planning and his apparent consideration of potential problems that might arise during the treasure recovery process. Before we finalize any agreements with investors, I want to conduct one more phase of preliminary investigation, Thomas proposed. Ground-penetrating radar will give us much more detailed information about what's buried at the site and will provide additional evidence for potential investors about the likelihood of successful treasure recovery. The ground-penetrating radar survey would cost approximately $5,000, but would provide detailed three-dimensional images of buried objects, allowing Elena and Thomas to determine the size, shape, and composition of whatever was buried in the location indicated by Cassidy's map. The radar results would also help plan the excavation process and estimate the time and equipment needed for successful treasure recovery. Elena agreed to the radar survey as a final verification step before committing to the full excavation project. The $5,000 cost represented a significant expense for her current budget, but Thomas offered to advance the money and deduct it from her eventual share of any recovered treasure. The ground-penetrating radar survey was scheduled for the following week, with results available within days of the completion of the scanning work. If the radar confirmed the presence of substantial buried objects consistent with the treasure described in Cassidy's documentation, Elena and Thomas would proceed with investor negotiations and formal excavation planning. Elena realized that she was committing herself and Sophia to a course of action that would fundamentally change their lives, regardless of whether the treasure recovery was ultimately successful. The publicity and attention associated with a major archaeological excavation would transform their quiet ranch into a center of media interest and public curiosity that would affect their privacy and security permanently. But Elena also understood that her current circumstances offered no sustainable path forward, and that the treasure recovery project represented her family's best hope for achieving the financial security and stability that would allow Sophia to grow up with opportunities and advantages that Elena's current income could never provide. The ground-penetrating radar survey took place on a crisp October morning when the desert air was finally cool enough to work outdoors without the crushing heat that had dominated Elena's first months at the ranch. The technical crew arrived at dawn in a convoy of specialized vehicles that looked more like something from a science fiction movie than equipment Elena would have expected to see on her remote Nevada property. Dr. Sarah Chen, the geophysicist who supervised the radar scanning operation, had driven from the University of Nevada's Archaeological Research Center with equipment that cost more than Elena's annual income and could detect buried objects with precision that seemed almost magical. The radar scanning process itself was methodical and time-consuming, requiring the technical team to move their equipment across the designated search area in precise grid patterns while recording data that would later be processed into three-dimensional images of whatever lay beneath. The desert surface. Elena watched the process with fascination and growing anxiety, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether Thomas Hartwell's 15 years of research had led them to genuine buried treasure or to the most expensive disappointment of her life. Dr. Chen explained that ground-penetrating radar worked by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the time it took for those pulses to bounce back from buried objects or geological features. Different materials reflected the radar signals in characteristic ways, allowing trained technicians to distinguish between natural rock formations, metal objects, organic materials, and empty spaces that might indicate buried chambers or containers. We're looking for anomalies that are consistent with human-made objects rather than natural geological features, Dr. Chen explained, as her team systematically scanned the area indicated by Cassidy's map. Metal containers, wooden strongboxes, or constructed chambers would all show distinctive radar signatures that are quite different from the background patterns we'd expect to see in undisturbed desert soil. Elena found herself holding her breath as the radar equipment passed over the exact location where Thomas's metal detection survey had identified the strongest signals. The electronic displays on the radar unit showed complex wave patterns and data streams that meant nothing to Elena, but caused Dr. Chen and her technicians to exchange meaningful glances and make detailed notes about specific readings and measurements. Thomas stood beside Elena during the scanning process, equally nervous and excited about the results that would either validate his decades of research or prove that his grandfather's documentation had led him on an elaborate wild goose chase across the American West. His confident demeanor of the past few days had given way to obvious anxiety as the moment of truth approached, and Elena realized that despite his extensive preparation and research, Thomas was also taking a significant personal and financial risk by pursuing the treasure recovery project. The preliminary radar results were available within 2 hours of completing the field scanning, displayed on laptop computers that processed the electromagnetic data into visual representations of underground features. Dr. Chen called Elena and Thomas over to examine the initial findings, and what they saw on the computer screen was so remarkable that Elena had to sit down on a nearby rock to process the implications. "You have definitely got something significant buried down there," Dr. Chen announced, pointing to clear geometric patterns on the radar display that were obviously artificial rather than natural. The readings show a rectangular chamber, approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, constructed at a depth of 11.5 feet, with what appears to be a stone or concrete cap covering the entrance. The radar images revealed details that corresponded precisely to the construction methods described in Butch Cassidy's documentation. The underground chamber was positioned exactly where the map indicated it should be located, and its dimensions matched the specifications that Thomas had found in the Wild Bunch correspondence. Most remarkably, the radar had detected multiple large metal objects within the chamber, objects that were consistent in size and shape with the strongboxes and containers that Cassidy's notes described as holding the railroad robbery proceeds. The metal objects appear to be arranged systematically within the chamber rather than scattered randomly, Dr. Chen continued, showing Elena and Thomas detailed cross-sectional views of the buried structure. This suggests deliberate placement by people who were organizing valuable materials for long-term storage, rather than simply disposing of unwanted items. Elena stared at the radar images, trying to comprehend that she was looking at scientific evidence of buried treasure worth $25 million, located less than 50 yards from her kitchen window. The mathematical precision of the chamber's construction and the obvious care that had been taken to conceal its location suggested that whoever had buried these objects had indeed intended them to remain hidden for an extended period. Thomas was equally amazed by the radar results, though his excitement was tempered by the realization that successful detection of the treasure was only the beginning of a complex and expensive recovery process. "The chamber construction is exactly what Cassidy's notes described," he said, comparing the radar images to sketches in his historical documentation. This level of correspondence between the written records and the physical evidence proves that we're dealing with authentic wild bunch materials. Dr. Chen's professional assessment of the radar findings was unequivocal in its conclusion that Elena's property contained a significant archaeological site that warranted immediate professional excavation. In 30 years of conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys, I've never seen buried anomalies that were more clearly indicative of deliberately concealed valuable materials, she told Elena. Whatever is buried in that chamber was placed there by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who expected to return for it at some point in the future. The radar survey results also revealed additional details about the treasure site that hadn't been apparent from Thomas's preliminary metal detection work. The chamber appeared to be connected to a network of smaller storage areas and possibly escape tunnels that suggested the wild bunch had constructed an elaborate hiding complex rather than simply burying money in a single location. The secondary chambers and connecting passages indicate that this site was used as more than just a temporary hiding place, Dr. Chen explained, showing Elena radar images of additional underground features that extended beyond the main treasure chamber. This looks like a carefully planned installation that was designed to serve as a long-term base of operations for people who needed to remain hidden from law enforcement. Elena realized that the treasure recovery project was potentially much larger and more significant than she had initially understood. Instead of simply excavating a single buried cache of stolen money, they might be uncovering an entire wild bunch hideout that could provide unprecedented insights into the gang's operations and methods. The historical and archaeological value of such a discovery could be enormous, potentially rivaling the financial value of any recovered treasure. Thomas was particularly excited by the radar evidence of additional chambers and passages, which corresponded to references in his grandfather's documentation about wild bunch hideouts that had been designed to accommodate extended stays by gang members who were avoiding law enforcement attention. Cassidy's group was known for their elaborate planning and their ability to disappear completely when necessary, he explained. This site might represent the most sophisticated hideout they ever constructed. The expanded scope of the potential discovery also meant that the excavation process would be more complex and expensive than Elena and Thomas had originally planned. Dr. Chen estimated that properly excavating and documenting the entire site could require 6 to 8 weeks of work with multiple archaeological teams, specialized equipment, and extensive documentation. Procedures that would cost significantly more than their initial $93,000 budget. A discovery of this magnitude would attract attention from federal agencies, historical societies, and media organizations throughout the country, Dr. Chen warned Elena and Thomas. You need to be prepared for the fact that this excavation will become a major public event with implications that extend far beyond your immediate financial interests. Elena had not fully considered the public attention and media scrutiny that would accompany a major archaeological discovery on her property. The prospect of national news coverage, curious visitors, and government oversight was simultaneously exciting and terrifying for someone who had been struggling with basic financial survival just days earlier. The radar results also confirmed that Elena would need to move quickly to secure investor funding and begin the excavation process before word of the discovery leaked to competitors or treasure hunters who might attempt to interfere with the project. Dr. Chen explained that archaeological sites of this significance were often targeted by illegal artifact hunters and amateur treasure seekers who could damage or destroy valuable historical evidence in their attempts to recover valuable objects. Thomas had anticipated the need for enhanced security and had already contacted private security firms that specialized in protecting archaeological excavation sites from unauthorized interference. The security costs would add approximately $15,000 to the project budget, but would be essential for ensuring that the excavation could proceed without disruption from treasure hunters or curiosity seekers who might learn about the discovery through media coverage or word-of-mouth communication. Elena found herself facing decisions about publicity and media management that she felt completely unprepared to handle. Thomas suggested that they hire a public relations consultant who could help them control the flow of information about the discovery and potentially negotiate lucrative media deals that could offset some of the excavation costs while building public interest in their story. The right media strategy could turn this discovery into a significant income source beyond just the treasure recovery, Thomas explained. Documentary film rights, book deals, and television appearances could provide substantial compensation while also ensuring that our story is told accurately and professionally. Elena was intrigued by the possibility that media attention could provide additional financial benefits, but she was also concerned about protecting Sophia's privacy and ensuring that their sudden fame didn't disrupt her daughter's education and social development. The 7-year-old was already dealing with the stress of their unstable living situation, and Elena worried that media attention and public scrutiny might create additional challenges for a child who needed stability and normalcy. The investor. Negotiations took on new urgency and complexity as Elena and Thomas prepared to present the radar survey results to potential funding sources. The scientific evidence of significant buried treasure made their project much more attractive to investors, but it also meant that they were likely to receive multiple competing offers that would require careful evaluation and negotiation. Harrison Webb, the technology investor who had expressed interest in funding the excavation, responded to the radar results by immediately offering to increase his investment and reduce his percentage share of any recovered treasure. His revised proposal would provide $150,000 in funding for the expanded excavation in exchange for just 15% of the eventual recovery, terms that were significantly more favorable than any other financing option Elena and Thomas had identified. Webb understands that the historical significance of this discovery will provide him with publicity and recognition that are worth more than purely financial returns, Thomas explained. His revised offer reflects the fact that he wants to be associated with what could be the most important wild bunch discovery in history. The Nevada Archaeological Investment Group also revised their funding proposal in response to the radar results, offering to provide complete project funding including security, media management, and legal support in exchange for 20% of the recovered treasure plus exclusive rights to any artifacts that weren't claimed by museums or government agencies. Elena realized that she was suddenly in the enviable position of choosing between multiple attractive funding offers rather than desperately seeking any available financing for a project that might or might not succeed. The radar evidence had transformed her from a supplicant seeking investment assistance into a partner, with a valuable opportunity that sophisticated investors were competing to support. The decision about which investor to partner with would have implications that extended far beyond the immediate financial terms of their agreements. Different investors offered different levels of expertise, media connections, and long-term support that could affect not only the success of the excavation, but also Elena's ability to manage the aftermath of a major archaeological discovery. Elena spent the evening reviewing investor proposals and trying to understand the complex legal and financial implications of partnerships that would affect her family's future for years to come. The transformation from struggling single mother to partner in a multi-million-dollar archaeological venture had happened so quickly that Elena sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life rather than making decisions about her own circumstances. But the radar images displayed on her kitchen table provided undeniable evidence that $25 million worth of buried treasure was waiting less than 50 yards from where she sat, and that the next decision she made would determine whether she and Sophia would spend the rest of their lives in financial security or continue struggling with the poverty and uncertainty that had characterized their existence since Marcus had abandoned them 5 years earlier. Elena signed the partnership agreement with Harrison Webb on a Tuesday morning in early November, sitting in the law offices of Chen Rodriguez and Associates in Las Vegas, while autumn sunshine streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of a city she had never imagined herself having business in. The contract signing ceremony felt surreal to someone who had been counting quarters for groceries just 6 weeks earlier, but the legal documents spread across the polished conference table represented the formal beginning of what would become the most extensively documented treasure recovery operation in Nevada history. Harrison Webb turned out to be a surprisingly modest man in his early 60s who wore jeans and a polo shirt to the contract signing and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had built multiple successful companies and was now pursuing archaeological projects as a personal passion rather than a business necessity. His decision to fund the excavation had been motivated as much by his fascination with Wild Bunch history as by the potential financial returns, and his presence at the contract signing reflected his intention to be actively involved in the treasure recovery process, rather than simply providing money and waiting for results. "I've been reading about Butch Cassidy since I was 12 years old," Webb explained to Elena as they reviewed the final contract terms. The opportunity to potentially recover the proceeds from their final robbery and to document what might be the most sophisticated hideout they ever constructed is worth far more to me than any financial investment I could make in technology companies or real estate development. The partnership agreement they signed was more comprehensive and favorable to Elena than she had dared to hope when Thomas first approached her with his treasure theory. Webb would provide $160,000 in funding for the complete excavation, security, legal compliance, and media management, while receiving only 15% of any recovered treasure. Elena would retain 50% ownership of any discoveries. Thomas would receive 35% for his research and project management, and all parties would share equally in any media revenues or intellectual property rights that emerged from documenting the discovery. The contract also included provisions that protected Elena's interests in ways that demonstrated Webb's experience with complex business partnerships and his genuine concern for ensuring that all parties were treated fairly throughout the treasure recovery process. Elena would receive a guaranteed minimum payment of $50,000, regardless of whether any treasure was actually recovered, providing immediate financial relief for her family's urgent needs while the excavation proceeded. Webb had also insisted on including clauses that protected Elena and Sophia from excessive media intrusion and ensured that any publicity about the discovery would be managed professionally to preserve their privacy and security. The contract specified that Elena would have final approval over any media interviews, documentary participation, or public appearances that involved her family, giving her control over how their story was presented to the public. The excavation itself was scheduled to begin immediately after the contract signing, with archaeological teams, security personnel, and specialized equipment mobilizing to Elena's ranch within days of finalizing the partnership agreements. Webb had assembled what Thomas described as the most qualified and experienced treasure recovery team ever organized for a private archaeological project, including experts who had worked on major historical discoveries throughout the American West. Dr. Patricia Williams, the lead archaeologist for the excavation, had supervised treasure recovery operations at sites throughout Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, including several projects that had uncovered significant Wild Bunch artifacts and hideout locations. Her experience with outlaw archaeology and her reputation for meticulous documentation would ensure that the treasure recovery was conducted according to the highest professional standards while preserving the historical integrity of any discoveries. The security team was headed by Marcus Thompson, a former federal agent who specialized in protecting high-value archaeological sites from interference by unauthorized treasure hunters or media personnel. Thompson's security plan included round-the-clock surveillance of the excavation site, background checks for all personnel with access to the property, and coordination with local law enforcement agencies to ensure that the treasure recovery could proceed without disruption or security threats. Elena found the transformation of her quiet ranch into the center of a major archaeological operation, both exciting and overwhelming. Within 3 days of signing the partnership agreement, her property was occupied by more people and equipment than she had seen in the entire 4 months since moving to the ranch. Temporary buildings were erected to house the archaeological team. Security personnel established a command center in her barn, and specialized excavation equipment was positioned around the treasure site with military precision. The media attention began even before the excavation started, with news crews and journalists arriving at Elena's ranch after word of the discovery leaked through archaeological networks and treasure hunting communities. Webb's media management team worked to control the flow of information while building public interest in what they were marketing as potentially the most significant wild bunch discovery in history. Elena's first television interview was conducted by a correspondent from the History Channel who had flown to Nevada specifically to document the early stages of the treasure recovery operation. The interview took place on Elena's front porch, with the excavation site visible in the background, and Elena found herself describing her transformation from struggling single mother to archaeological partner with a sense of disbelief that still characterized her adjustment to these extraordinary circumstances. 6 weeks ago, I was facing foreclosure and wondering how I was going to provide basic necessities for my daughter, Elena told the interviewer. Today, I'm partnering with some of the most respected archaeologists in the country to potentially recover one of the most famous lost treasures in American history. The change has been so dramatic that I sometimes feel like I'm living someone else's life. The excavation process itself was far more complex and time-consuming than Elena had anticipated, even after Dr. Chen's warnings about the scope and significance of the buried site. The archaeological team began by carefully removing layers of desert soil and documenting every artifact, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, that they encountered during the digging process. The first major discovery came on the 4th day of excavation, when the team uncovered the stone cap that covered the entrance to the main treasure chamber. The cap was a precisely cut piece of local sandstone that had been shaped and positioned to blend seamlessly with the surrounding rock formations, making it virtually invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look for it. The craftsmanship and attention to detail evident in the cap's construction confirmed that the Wild Bunch had indeed invested considerable time and effort in creating a hiding place that could remain concealed for decades. Elena was present when the archaeological team lifted the stone cap and revealed the entrance to the chamber that had been sealed for over a century. The opening led to a carefully constructed underground room that was larger and more sophisticated than even the ground-penetrating radar had indicated, with wooden support beams, stone walls, and a drainage system that had kept the interior remarkably dry despite more than 100 years of burial. The chamber itself contained exactly what Butch Cassidy's documentation had promised: multiple wooden strongboxes and metal containers that had been arranged systematically along the walls of the underground room. The containers showed signs of age and weathering, but appeared to be structurally intact, suggesting that their contents had been protected from moisture and deterioration by the careful construction of the hiding place. Dr. Williams insisted on documenting every aspect of the chamber's construction and contents before opening any of the containers, a process that required detailed photography, measurements, and chemical analysis of materials that might provide insights into Wild Bunch construction techniques and operational methods. Elena understood the importance of proper archaeological documentation, but she found the methodical pace of the process almost unbearably suspenseful as she waited to learn whether the containers actually held the treasure described in Cassidy's map. The first strongbox was opened on November 15th, exactly 3 weeks after the excavation had begun, in a ceremony that was attended by Elena, Thomas, Webb, and the core archaeological team. Dr. Williams used specialized tools to carefully remove the metal clasps and hinges that had secured the box for over a century, working slowly to avoid damaging any contents that might have been affected by age or environmental conditions. When the lid of the strongbox was finally lifted, Elena found herself looking at more money than she had ever seen in one place. Stacks of gold coins, paper currency, and silver dollars that filled the container nearly to capacity. The denominations and dates of the currency corresponded exactly to what would have been circulating during the early 1900s, and the quantity of money was consistent with proceeds from a major railroad robbery. Dr. Williams estimated that the first strongbox contained approximately $400,000 in period currency, an amount that would be worth several $1 million in contemporary purchasing power. But more importantly, the discovery confirmed that Cassidy's documentation was accurate and that the remaining containers likely held the full $25 million worth of treasure that the Wild Bunch had accumulated from their final robbery. The opening of subsequent containers revealed not only money, but also personal artifacts that provided unprecedented insights into Wild Bunch operations and individual gang members. The team discovered weapons, personal correspondence, photographs, and clothing that had been preserved in remarkable condition by the dry desert environment and careful construction of the storage chamber. Thomas was particularly excited by the discovery of additional maps and documentation that appeared to describe other Wild Bunch hideouts and robbery locations throughout the Western Territories. The archaeological value of these materials might eventually prove to be even more significant than the financial value of the recovered treasure, providing historians with primary source materials that could revolutionize understanding of outlaw operations. During the early 1900s, Elena watched the systematic cataloging and documentation of each discovery with amazement and growing excitement about the financial implications for her family's future. Conservative estimates suggested that the total value of recovered treasure and artifacts would exceed $30 million, an amount that would provide Elena and Sophia with financial security beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. The media coverage of the treasure discovery quickly escalated from regional news stories to national and international attention as the significance of the archaeological findings became apparent. Elena found herself fielding interview requests from news organizations around the world, all wanting to document the story of the single mother who had become guardian of the most valuable lost treasure in American frontier history. Webb's media management team helped Elena navigate the publicity with grace and professionalism, ensuring that she maintained control over her family's story while building public interest that would maximize the value of media rights and documentary opportunities. The combination of historical significance, human interest, and dramatic financial transformation made Elena's story irresistible to media organizations seeking compelling content about contemporary American dreams and unexpected success. The treasure recovery also attracted attention from museums, historical societies, and academic institutions that were interested in acquiring artifacts for research and public display. The Smithsonian Institution, The Buffalo Bill Center of the West and several major universities submitted proposals for purchasing or borrowing significant pieces from the collection, creating additional revenue opportunities that could supplement the direct financial value of the recovered treasure. Elena realized that her role had evolved from treasure hunter to curator of historically significant materials that belonged not only to her family, but also to the broader American public that was fascinated by Wild Bunch history and frontier archaeology. The responsibility for preserving and sharing these discoveries added dimensions to her new circumstances that went far beyond personal financial benefits. The excavation continued for 6 weeks as the archaeological team methodically documented and recovered every item from the treasure chamber and connected storage areas. The final tally included over $28 million in period currency and precious metals, plus artifacts and documentation that historians valued as priceless contributions to understanding Wild Bunch operations and early 20th century outlaw culture. Elena's share of the treasure recovery, after paying excavation costs and investor fees, exceeded $15 million, an amount that transformed her from a struggling waitress into one of the wealthiest individuals in Nevada. But perhaps more importantly, the discovery had given Elena and Sophia a story of courage, persistence, and unexpected success that would inspire them throughout their lives and remind them that extraordinary opportunities sometimes come disguised as ordinary acts of human kindness. The treasure that Butch Cassidy had buried over a century earlier had finally found its way to someone who would use it not only for personal benefit, but also for preserving history and contributing to the community that had supported Elena during her most difficult times. The transformation was complete, but Elena understood that her new responsibilities as guardian of this historical legacy were just beginning. 5 years after the discovery that changed her life forever, Elena Vasquez stood before the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Elena Vasquez Wild Bunch Research Center, a state-of-the-art facility built on the site where Butch Cassidy's treasure had been buried for over a century. The research center, funded entirely by Elena's treasure discovery and designed to preserve Wild Bunch history for future generations, represented the culmination of her transformation from struggling single mother to one of the most influential historical preservationists in the American West. The November morning was crisp and clear, with over 300 guests assembled to witness the opening of a facility that would house the world's most comprehensive collection of Wild Bunch artifacts and provide educational opportunities for students, researchers, and history enthusiasts from around the globe. Sophia, now 12 years old and confident beyond her years, stood beside her mother as they prepared to cut the ribbon that would officially open the center that bore Elena's name. 5 years ago, I gave a glass of water to a stranger who was suffering from heat exhaustion, Elena told the assembled crowd, which included Harrison Webb, Thomas Hartwell, Dr. Patricia Williams, and dozens of other partners who had helped make the Treasure Recovery and Research Center possible. That simple act of kindness led to the discovery of $28 million in buried treasure. But more importantly, it taught me that the most valuable things in life are often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right combination of compassion, courage, and collaboration to bring them into the light. The research center itself was a testament to Elena's commitment to using her unexpected wealth for purposes that extended far beyond personal comfort and security. The 15,000-square-foot facility included climate-controlled archives for preserving historical documents, interactive exhibits that brought Wild Bunch history to life for visitors of all ages, and research laboratories where scholars could study artifacts using the latest archaeological and forensic techniques. The center's crown jewel was the Cassidy Chamber, a full-scale recreation of the underground hideout where the treasure had been discovered, complete with authentic artifacts and immersive technology that allowed visitors to experience what it might have been like to be part of Butch Cassidy's gang during their final days in Nevada. The exhibit had been designed with input from leading historians and museum professionals to ensure both historical accuracy and engaging presentation. Elena had also established the Wild Bunch Educational Foundation with an initial endowment of $5 million, providing scholarships for students pursuing degrees in archaeology, history, and museum studies. The foundation's first recipients included 3 students from Nevada communities similar to the one where Elena had grown up. Young people who shared her understanding of how education could transform lives and open opportunities that might otherwise remain inaccessible. Thomas Hartwell had used his share of the treasure discovery to establish a publishing company specializing in Western history and frontier archaeology. His definitive book about the treasure discovery, The Last Cache, Butch Cassidy's Final Secret, had become a bestseller and was being adapted into a major motion picture starring Academy Award-winning actors who had been drawn to the story's themes of perseverance, family loyalty, and unexpected redemption. Harrison Webb's investment in the treasure recovery had provided returns that exceeded his most optimistic projections, but his greatest satisfaction came from the recognition he had received as a patron of historical research and archaeological discovery. The Webb Institute for Western Archaeological Studies, established with funding from his treasure recovery profits, was training the next generation of archaeologists who would continue exploring the American West's hidden history. Sophia had adapted to her family's changed circumstances with remarkable maturity and perspective, understanding that her mother's success carried responsibilities to help others and preserve important historical knowledge for future generations. She had become an accomplished public speaker who often joined Elena at educational events, sharing her perspective as a child who had witnessed her family's transformation and learned valuable lessons about courage, generosity, and the importance of taking calculated risks when extraordinary opportunities arise. The economic impact of Elena's discovery had extended far beyond her personal circumstances, bringing tourism revenue and national attention to a region of Nevada that had previously struggled with economic decline and population loss. The research center was expected to attract over 100,000 visitors annually, providing employment opportunities and business development that would benefit the entire community for generations to come. Elena had also used her resources to address the kind of financial emergencies that had once threatened her own family's stability. The Vasquez Family Emergency Fund provided interest-free loans and grants to Nevada families facing foreclosure, medical emergencies, or other financial crises that threatened their housing security or children's educational opportunities. Over the past 5 years, the fund had assisted more than 200 families, preventing foreclosures and providing support that allowed struggling parents to maintain stability during difficult periods. The research center's opening ceremony concluded with Elena and Sophia cutting the ceremonial ribbon, while cameras captured the moment for media outlets around the world that continued to follow their story. As visitors began exploring the exhibits and archives that would preserve Wild Bunch history for future researchers, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment in just 5 extraordinary years. "The most important lesson I've learned," Elena said during her final remarks to the assembled crowd, "is that success isn't measured by what we accumulate for ourselves, but by what we contribute to others and what we leave behind for future generations." Butch Cassidy's treasure gave us financial resources, but the real treasure was discovering that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they choose kindness over caution and service over selfishness. The story of Elena Vasquez and the treasure that changed her life had become more than just an account of unexpected wealth and archaeological discovery. It had evolved into a modern parable about the power of compassion, the importance of perseverance, and the potential for individuals to transform not only their own circumstances, but also the lives of countless others who benefit from their generosity and vision. As Elena and Sophia walked through the research center that would preserve their legacy for generations to come, they carried with them the satisfaction of knowing that a simple act of kindness had ultimately created opportunities, preserved history, and inspired others to believe that extraordinary transformations are possible for anyone willing to help strangers in need and take courageous action when life presents unexpected possibilities. Their story proves that sometimes the most valuable treasures are discovered not by people seeking wealth, but by those seeking to serve others, and that the most lasting riches come from sharing our good fortune with communities that supported us during our most challenging times. What incredible stories of transformation and unexpected discovery inspire you? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how acts of kindness have changed your life or the lives of people you know. And if Elena's journey from struggle to success motivates you to believe in extraordinary possibilities, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, we've got an amazing story about a retired teacher who found a letter in her attic that led to uncovering a Civil War mystery worth millions. You won't want to miss it.